All right, so now we're going to look into intro to proofs. So here, a proof is a convincing argument that uses deductive reasoning. Every statement you make must be justified with a valid property. We're going to talk about the properties and some of them today. The list will grow as we go through the course. The following properties are super valuable. So when we're going through our example, we're going to think about how to get to the next step. So in the very first example, it says x minus 5 equals 12. How would I get to the next step? I would add 5 to both sides to get x equals 12. I'm sorry, x equals 17. So here, what did I do? The plus 5 is really what we're talking about. I added 5 to both sides. So that is addition, property of equality. Now, it's property of equality because we're doing one thing to each side. I'm not just doing one to one side, it's both sides. So we're going to call that property of equality. Do not forget that portion. So when we name things here, I'm going to actually abbreviate it. So property of equality, we're going to abbreviate as POE. So you could actually write that as well, POE. So the second example, it says x plus 6 equals 15. I could subtract 6 from both sides to get x equals 9. And that is my subtraction property of equality. So again, I'm abbreviating property of equality. Next example, if you are given 1/5 x equals negative 2, how do I get x by itself? To do that, I would be multiplying 5 to both sides, and x would equal negative 10. That is our multiplication property of equality. The next example, we have 2x equals 8. How am I going to get x by itself? To get x by itself, we are going to be dividing both sides by 2 to get x equal 4. So that's our division property of equality. All right, the next one, it says y equals 2x plus 2 and x equals 5. How would I get the next step? We can see that we have a value for x, so we're going to substitute that in. So I have y equals 10 plus 2. Notice I'm not simplifying that problem any further. We're just talking about the step itself. So that property is called substitution. Okay, so you should have heard of all those from the top portion. And now we're going to talk about some other important properties. All right, so the very first one, it says if you are given 30, we can conclude 30 equals 30. And that's called reflexive. Sometimes we'll actually see in some of our diagrams, things we'll talk about is angle A is congruent to angle A. That's another version of reflexive. It's not always just with numbers. All right, the next one, we have 5 equals x. What do we normally do when we have this? We flip it. We have x equals 5. And that property is called symmetric. So symmetric allows us to flip our property. All right, the next one, we have y equals j and j equals negative 13. So for this problem, you can see they both have j in common. So I can link it together and I can write y equals negative 13. That is our transitive property. Our next example is 12 equals 3 times the quantity of x minus 9. Our next step would be to distribute those numbers. So we have 12 equals 3x minus 27. That is our distributive property. All right, the next one we have y equals 3 times 4 minus 12. Our next step that we want to do is to simplify. We would have y equals 12 minus 12. So the property that we allowed us to do that is simplify, or simplification. Then the last one here is if you are given 100 equals 45x minus 20, what would you do next? We would combine like terms. We would have 100 equals 25x. And again, combine like terms. On this paper, you do have these three that you might not have heard of that I'm highlighting. Keep in mind that you are responsible to know the entire page, but the three I highlighted will come back quite often. So just be mindful of that. All right, let's turn to our next page and do some practice. All right, so on this page, it says that we're going to identify what properties they use when they're giving us an equation or a situation and they tell us the next line. So in number 1, it says 6x plus 2 equals 12. And we went to the next step of 6x equals 10. How did they get there? You should see that they subtracted 2 from both sides. So my answer for number 1 would be substitution, property of equality. All right, number 2, we're given 45 equals x, and then they tell us the next step was x equals 45. Which property was that? What allowed us to flip it? Good, so that's symmetric. Number 3, we have 3x minus 7x equals 20. And then the next line is negative 4x equals 20. What did we do to get there? We combined like terms. Number 4, we have 4 times the quantity of q minus x equals r. And then we have the answer of 4q minus 4x equals r. What did we do to get there? Right, we distributed the 4 to inside the parentheses. So distributive property. Number 6, it says if a equals r and r equals 60, then a equals 60. Notice we have r in both, so we can link this together. So I have that a equals 60. What property allows me to link it together? That's my transitive property. All right, number 6, I'm going to put a star on. This is more of a thinking type of question. It says, if B is the midpoint of GH, then what? What can we conclude? They didn't even give us the conclusion. So we do have the term midpoint, which we should know. And I can tell you from that, I can sketch out a picture. I know I have a segment of GH with a midpoint of B. Because I have the word midpoint, what can I put on my diagram to show that I have a midpoint? I can put those tick marks. Those tick marks show me that those segments are congruent. So now I can write my conclusion. I could say GB is congruent to BH. I was able to do that because of the word midpoint. So my reason here is definition, and I'm abbreviating definition, of midpoint. All right, so that word midpoint was very crucial for me to be able to solve number 6. All right, so now we're going to get into our first 2-column proof example using some algebra skills. So just like we did in Uno, taking it step by step and providing a reason for each part of the line. So you can see this is our problem that we're working with. It says given 45 plus 2 times x minus 10 equals 85. And then we're going to prove x equals 30. Just as a reminder, that given line is our first line here. That's what we start with. And our reason for our first line is given. Now we want to see how do we get from the first line to the second line. And you can see that we subtract 45 from both sides. I do not have to show the subtraction in between the steps. I'm going to show that by writing my reason. So this is subtraction. Now, if you need to write your steps in between very small, that's okay, but we don't have to show them. All right, so now from step 2 to 3, what did we do? So notice we went from parentheses to no parentheses. Did we distribute or did we divide? What did we do? Right, we distributed. So you can see we actually have 2x minus 20 on the left side. So distribute, or distributive property. Then from line 3 to 4, we added 20 to both sides. So I'm going to write addition, POE. And then from line 4 to 5, I'm going to write how I got to my last line. So what did I do? 2x equals 60. To get x by itself, we divide. So division, POE. And notice our last line here, it says x equals 30. Well, that's what we should have at our very last line on our proof. All right, so now let's look at our next example. So here we have our given and what we want to prove. So I'm going to fill that in for line 1. I'm going to write the whole thing out. 4x minus 2 times 2 minus x equals 4x minus 24. And again, the reason for writing that first line is given. Then we go to our next line. And how did we go to our next line? What did we do? We subtracted 4x from both sides. So that's subtraction, POE. And then for our next line, what did we do? How did we go from line 2 to 3? Did we distribute? Did we divide? What did we do? We divided. So division, POE. Now, that's what they chose and how they're showing their work. Remember that this is just explaining someone else's work. Could we have distributed instead? Yes, but in this case, we're not doing that. We're just justifying their steps. So we're using division. And then from line 3 to 4, how do we go from line 3 to 4? We subtracted 2 from both sides. So subtraction, POE. And then line 4 to 5. So we have to fill in our statement, x equals negative 10. And how do we go from 4 to 5? How do we get rid of that negative? We divide it by negative 1. So division, POE. All right, so on the next page, I'd like you to try the next one on your own. You can pause your screen, and then we'll go over it. All right, so for our first line, you should have 3x plus 4y equals 23, and they tell us that x equals 1. We want to write that all there, and that's a given. All right, and then the second line, you can see that they took that information for x and plugged it in. So we should be writing substitution. In line 3 to 4, they multiplied 3 times 1, so we simplified. And then line 3 to 4, we subtracted 3 from both sides. So subtraction, POE. And then line 4 to 5, we have y equals 5, as we should, because that's in our proof statement. And we divided, so division, POE. Okay, so overall, keep in mind that we need to know our properties. The list is going to grow, and you also need to know your definitions because they're also going to be very helpful. Just like we saw in one of the examples for midpoint, that was one of the reasons why I could justify my answer. So we're going to continue practicing in this section, so make sure you just highlight the key terms, and we'll try some in class.